Good morning, everyone. My name is Mireille Atala. I'm head of Nature for Climate branch at UNEP, and it's my great pleasure and honor to be moderating this event today. The event is entitled What We Need from the Global Stocktake, Insights from the latest UNEP Emissions Gap Report and the UNFCCC NDC Synthesis Report. The two reports were published towards mid-end of November, providing substance, information, science, and data to help inform the negotiations and the discussions here today, and at the COP more broadly. So what do these two reports mean for the global stocktake that was also released and that's being discussed? What do they imply for the mitigation work program, for the ambition in terms of our emission reduction targets? It's a great pleasure for me to be moderating the first panel with us today. And I would first like to call Ms. Inger Anderson, Undersecretary General, Executive Director of UNEP, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mireille Atala, our brilliant Director for Adaptation in UNEP. And a big congratulations to the authors group that you just saw here, and to the scientific editor, and Olhoff, and of course to Martin Capelle for being the UNEP, within the UNEP lead coordinator. Look, this report, the front cover has gotten a lot of positive, negative kind of coverage because, in fact, there were some people on Twitter spheres who said, the cover is so sassy that I thought it was a parody. I actually had to check the actual URL on the website to be sure that it was really UNEP. But the truth is that we are not where we need to be on emissions reduction, and that is what broken records in terms of temperatures, broken records in terms of wildfires, broken records in terms of floods and droughts, and yes, broken records in terms of promises made but not kept. And that's the story of this report. Unfortunately, it's not the first time that we tell this story, but we will continue to hold up that mirror to the world and to tell it, this is what you said you're going to do, and this is what you're doing. And of course, we do shine an extra light on the 20 largest economies and the G20, who are responsible for 75% or so of all global emissions, and have been since we got going on this. And if we had done what we said we were going to do back in the beginning of time of this convention, we would not be having a need for adaptation, let alone for loss and damage. So it's time now to step up. It's time to halt these extreme emissions. We see in this report that the G20 emissions did not only stagnate, they actually went up. And we see in this report that we went from, what was it, 55 gigatons in 21 to 57.9 or so in 22. And if this is a trend that we're on, well, then obviously the 2.9 degrees in 2100 is a given. And this report tells us that if we take the conditional and both the unconditional and the conditional, then we are likely to hit 2.5 degrees. 2.5? We're living at 1.1 or so now, and we're getting socked with 86 days of extreme temperatures last year, with what we are seeing across the world just right now on our news screens. In a sense, next year maybe we'll just say refer to the evening TV bulletin, because there is no more to say here. The truth is that the world is not living up to its promises. And so yes, the NDCs are critical, but what is even more critical is action on the biggest emitters. And when we look at the net zero pledges, many of them are paper pledges and are not credible, and therefore cannot really be taken into account. But we will hear more of this from my brilliant colleagues. What we are also concerned about is, of course, the inequality and the injustice around this, because 10% of the population with the highest income account for 48% of emissions, and I put it to you that we are all part of the 10%. And so that means that the bottom 50% of the world contributes just 12% of emissions. I often quote the fact that South Sudan, a country I know well, has 7.9% access to modern electricity, yet is an oil producer. What is the world's response to a country such as South Sudan that obviously has every desire to develop, every desire to provide 100% electricity, and yet we would advise them not to develop their hydrocarbon resources, but without just transition, without investments, clearly that would be a hard thing to do for any leader, and you would feel similarly so if you were a citizen of South Sudan. So that is why the financing is important. And so we really need to see an acceleration economy-wide of low-carbon development transformation. Last year, you may recall, the emissions gap report focused on these 5 sectors that are critical, on obviously the mobility sector, on the power sector, on the buildings and construction sector, on the agricultural sector, and on the finance sector. These are all important. Being in the middle of the plastics negotiation, today I would have added the plastics and the petrochemical sector, because we know that by 2040, at the tense of increase that we are seeing now in plastic production, and without a plastic treaty, by 2040, 20% of our CO2 emissions could potentially be derived from plastics, either its production or its incineration. But anyhow, the importance here is that we understand the promise that we made in Paris. We get that we need to get there, but this is the time to step up, because this broken record can no longer play. You put the stylus on the record and you know that you will only hear scratches, and that's not the way we want to go. Thank you very much.
Inger, thank you very much for reminding us that this is part of a continuum. It's not adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage in silos. It's all connected, and what we do here actually undoes what we do there. And on that note, I would like to invite Simon Steele, Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, to talk us through the NDC report.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, friends, Inga, here we go again. We were just in a session about the adaptation gap report, which spoke of underfinanced and underperformed. Now we're speaking about the emissions gap, and we're speaking about broken record. The scientific community has been warning us for years about the climate crisis and what we can do to address it. As this report shows, the policy response and subsequent implementation so far has been woefully inadequate. The report is particularly timely given we are concluding the first global stocktake here at COP28. From 2021 to 2022, emissions rose by 1.2% when they should be tumbling. Let's remember we need to cut emissions by 43% by 2030 if we are to be on track to hitting that 1.5 goal. If mitigation continues on the basis of current policies, we're heading for a heated world at 3 degrees. And we know that even at 1.5, the climate impacts will still be hell for many of the most vulnerable. The 3.5 most vulnerable around the world will still have major challenges at 1.5, let alone at 3 degrees. So colleagues, we have work to do. We know what we have to do. And what's quite remarkable is that it's actually in our power to do something about this. We can triple renewable energy. We can double energy efficiency. We can unlock and accelerate climate finance flows. And as we've just shown, we can make loss and damage a reality and help deliver on climate justice. But this means leaving fossil fuel dependency behind. Only renewables offers secure, affordable energy for all, amid a cost of living crisis partly fueled by volatile oil, coal, and gas, and delivering a just energy transition within and between countries, sharing benefits across all societies, leaving no one behind. This is the very spirit of the Paris Agreement. Non-party stakeholders have a vital role to play as well. Businesses, cities, and regions have to move towards a net zero clean energy economy and back their ambitions with credible near-term actions and transition plans. We can use the global stocktake to make COP28 a game changer, that course correction that is much needed, and provide a springboard for a 2-year climate action surge. We at UN Climate Change, together with our colleagues across the UN system, will do all we can to help parties to come together to do that and implement their climate goals. I thank you.
Simon, thank you very much for this reminder. To those who cannot relate what 3 degrees represent, I often say, think about what a 3-degree temperature rise for your body means, or if we are to use climate analogs, that in fact it means that weather in Rabat may become similar to weather in Nouakchott, and that helps it sink. So with this, I'd like to invite our phenomenal author, Anne Olof, to present the data, the science, and the prospects coming through.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mireille. And it's a pleasure to be here with you to present some of the key findings of this year's Emissions Gap Report. This is number 14. And each year, these reports are produced as annual, independent, and science-based assessments of the emissions gap, which is basically where we are heading in terms of global emissions, given the current pledges and mitigation pledges made by countries, and where we need to be, according to science, to have a likely chance, so at least 66% chance of getting on track for limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius. These reports would not exist without the tremendous efforts of everybody involved. And this year, we have had the pleasure of working together with 79 international leading scientists across 47 institutions and in 22 different countries. The process has been overseen by an international steering committee, and all the chapters have been out for external review, and we've also given the governments of the countries specifically mentioned in the report the chance to comment on preliminary findings. And as Simon just reminded us, and I'm sure we don't need to tell anybody in this room, what's special this year, of course, is that we're concluding the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And you can say that the emissions gap reports provide annual global stocktakes. We've been doing this for 14 years, and we also look into what are the options to bridge the emissions gap, what are the ways forward. But let's go into the context here, and let's start with developments in global emissions. And what we see from this slide is how these have developed since 1990. And although we can see that the rate of growth in global emissions has been slowing down, we're still seeing an increase. The increase in global greenhouse gas emissions between 2021 to 2022 was 1.2%, and they reached a record high of 57.4 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. The increase among the G20, who account for collectively for about 76% of global emissions, was also 1.2%. we see that by now all sectors apart from transportation have fully rebounded from the dip caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that they now exceed the 2019 levels. And we also see that non-CO2 gases that have much higher global warming potential, such as methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases, are increasing rapidly. At the same time, there's been very limited progress in terms of the nationally determined contributions since the last COP. Despite the call for countries to strengthen their 2030 target, by the cutoff date for our report, only 9 countries had responded to this call, and if fully implemented, these new and strengthened NDCs are only estimated to reduce global emissions in 2030 by 0.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. It's important to also realize that there has been progress since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And if we look at that, collectively, all the new and updated unconditional NDCs will result in reducing global emissions annually by about 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents relative to or compared with the initial NDCs. We also see that the NDCs themselves have evolved over time since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. More include greenhouse gas emissions targets, there's greater coverage of sectors and gases, and more include unconditional elements. But there's room for improvement. In terms of the GHG emissions targets, we still see that, the NDCs, in terms of sectoral coverage, only cover, the sector-wide NDCs only cover about 50% of global emissions. And we also see that only 30% of global emissions are covered by NDCs that include targets for all 7 gases under the Kyoto Protocol. Let's turn to the G20 and how they're faring in terms of meeting their pledges for 2030. What we see is that they're still not on track to do so. This figure basically shows you where the G20 countries individually and collectively are headed based on policies currently in place and where they and what their NDC targets for 2030 is. And what we see, though, is that the implementation gap is shrinking. That's the good news. So the difference between projected emissions under current policies and under full implementation of the NDCs is diminishing. For the G20 members, it's now 1.2 gigatons of CO2 equivalents annually. That's down 0.6 since last year's assessment. And globally, we see that the gap is now 1.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents annually for the unconditional NDCs, and that's actually half of what it was last year. And we also see that there has been progress if we look in terms of current policies since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. At the time of the adoption of the Paris Agreement, our projections showed that emissions in 2030, based on current policies, would be 16% higher. And now that projection is 3%. So progress is being made, but it's insufficient to bridge the emissions gap, which remains high. And here you see all the different scenarios that we're assessing, the current policies, the NDCs, and then where we need to be to have a likely chance of reaching the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And there's been very limited change since last year. It's more or less the same with small differences, basically due to rounding differences. Based on these scenarios, we are looking at an emissions gap of 14 gigatons of CO2 equivalents annually for a 2-degree goal, and of 22 gigatons of CO2 equivalents annually for a 1.5-degree goal. And if we then also have implementation, full implementation of the conditional pledges, these gaps are lowered by about 3 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. So that's 2030, but as we all know, in less than 2 years from now, countries are supposed to put forward new NDCs, and these are supposed to include targets for 2035. And although we don't know what this next round of pledges will be, we do know where they need to be in terms of global ambition. If we just continue along these scenarios that we're showing on the screen, the emissions gap will widen and potentially become unbridgeable. What we need to see in the next round of NDCs, if we look at comparing with the current unconditional NDCs, is that the next round of NDCs, what we should be aiming for globally, is that the 2030 targets cut off 18 gigatons of CO2 equivalents for the unconditional pledges for a 2-degree goal, and 29 gigatons of CO2 equivalents if we want to reach the 1.5 degree goal. So that's basically the homework assignment for countries. That's what the UNFCCC process needs to facilitate. This also means that if we go further into the future and if we look at the global warming implications, we are very far from reaching the Paris Agreement goal. What you see here is that a continuation of the level of effort implied by current policies basically only limits global warming over the course of this century to 3 degrees Celsius, and that the conditional and unconditional NDCs will bring us somewhere between 2.5 and 2.9 degrees. It's only if we put together all the most ambitious pledges on the table right now, so that's the conditional NDCs and all of the net zero pledges, and these are fully implemented, that we get closer to achieving the Paris Agreement temperature goal. And what we show in the report is that at this point in time, there's low confidence in the net zero pledges. It's great to see that more and more countries are putting forward net zero pledges, and these account for or cover about 80% of global emissions by now. But we also see that there are still issues. Some of them are not implemented or put down in law. We see a lack of clear and transparent implementation plans, and in many countries, emissions are still increasing. They haven't peaked, they haven't started to decrease. And what both Simon and Inga reminded us is that every fraction of a degree matters, and we also saw that in the previous session on the adaptation gap report. What we're really looking at is devastating effects if we continue current practices. We should also keep in mind that although we provide these best estimates of 3 degrees of global warming under current continuation of current policies, and 2 degrees if we implement everything that's on the table, these are the best estimates. Even if we look at the most optimistic case, there's only a 14% chance of actually limiting global warming to 1.45 degrees. And there's a huge chance to actually exceed 2 degrees of warming, even in this most ambitious case. Under current policies, the chance of reaching 1.5 is 0, and we still have quite a big risk of exceeding 3 degrees. So what does this mean? It basically means that the only way to maintain the possibility of achieving the Paris Agreement temperature goal is to focus relentlessly on strengthening implementation and action in this decade. This is needed to not only achieve the current pledges for 2030, but to overachieve them. We must go below the levels associated with current pledges in 2030 to narrow the emissions gap. That will facilitate putting forward significantly more ambitious pledges for 2035 in the next round of the NDCs, and at the same time help pave the way to enhance the credibility and the feasibility of the net zero pledges. And of course, science tells us if we end up at emissions levels in 2030 associated with the current pledges, 1.5 with no or low overshoot is no longer possible. The past emissions gap reports have focused a lot on the transformations that need to happen. We also heard this in the opening remarks, and all countries must urgently accelerate economy-wide low carbon transformation, and global transformations of the energy system is essential as it accounts for about 86% of global CO2 emissions. As this figure shows you, if we extract all the coal, oil, and gas of both the mines and fields that are currently producing and that are under construction, we will exceed the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees several times over. What needs to happen here? We need the high-emitting and the high-income countries to show the way forward, to significantly accelerate their emissions reductions and to reach net zero sooner than other countries. But we also need to bring on board the low and middle income countries that by now account for 69% of global emissions. And we need the wealthy countries to support the poorer countries in this process. In this year's report, we look into the options, the opportunities, and also the challenges for low and middle income countries in making the energy transitions that are needed. And we find that they face substantial economic and institutional challenges but also that there are significant opportunities to exploit. Of course, this needs to happen alongside with meeting basic development needs and also the other development aspirations in these countries. And just to note that 2.4 billion people still lack access to clean cooking fuels, and that 775 million lack access to electricity. So we need to see a strengthening of capacity in institutions domestically, and we need to see how to overcome political economy challenges. What we advocate and actually suggest in this report is that the next round of NDCs offers an opportunity for low and middle income countries to develop nationally driven roadmaps that both encompass climate and development objectives and that are coupled with investment-ready implementation plans, and that this COP offers the opportunity to secure the support that would be needed to do so. One thing that's clear is that access to affordable finance will be a prerequisite to increase mitigation ambition in low and middle-income countries. What we see in the report is that the cost of capital for renewables and in general is many times higher in poorer countries than in, for example, the United States of America and Europe. We also see that the scale of finance is insufficient and that the distribution of flows of finance primarily go to what we might call mature markets. That needs to change, and it needs to change now. Finally, we include a chapter on carbon dioxide removal, which is necessary to achieve the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. Basically, the net in net zero comes from sucking out some carbon from the atmosphere through carbon dioxide removal methods. And these methods can be classified both by how carbon is captured, where it's stored, and for how long it is stored. And this report, in the most durable carbon storage is in the lithosphere, so basically in geological structures and minerals. And our report focuses basically on the afforestation, reforestation, forest management, on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and direct air capture with carbon capture and storage, and enhanced weathering. It's clear that further delay in mitigation actions, serious mitigation actions, increases our future reliance on carbon dioxide removal. And if we look here, the 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios covered by the IPCC already assume quite significant levels, gigaton levels of CDR later in the century, whereas right now we primarily see that we are using afforestation, reforestation, and forest management. That's the contribution we have here, while the so-called novel CDR technologies are minuscule at the moment, but are increasing rapidly until the end of or the time at which CO2 emissions reach net zero. We also see that by far the most important thing is the rapid decarbonization, the rapid reduction in emissions from all fossil fuels. That is what's going to get us there, not carbon dioxide removal. It's needed, but it's not a substitute for rapid decarbonization. And of course, we see that the achievement of these gigatons level of CDR later in the century is still quite uncertain and associated with several and different risks depending on what type of carbon dioxide removal we're looking at. Furthermore, these technologies will have to go through a stage of being matured, and unless action is put into this by governments right now, it will be more risky to actually rely on carbon dioxide removal later in the century. We need to establish robust measurement, reporting, and verification systems, and we need to move also on CDR now. With that, I will end my presentation, and thank you all very much.
And thank you so much with this brilliant presentation, Between the adaptation gap report, the emissions gap report, we've taken stock of where we are. We've also raised some recommendations of where we can be, where we should be. CDRs and loss and damage or compensation for climate impacts should not be a reason for not mitigating climate impacts, emissions, and so, or for moving away from abatement. So I would really, really like to invite you. At UNEP, we do more than producing the reports. We are today launching the Global Cooling Pledge and the Global Cooling Watch. Cooling is a very exciting area because it generates positive dividends for mitigation, for adaptation, and for the ozone layer. So if you can, please join us at 12:30 for the media launch and at 6:30 for the launch of the pledge itself. Please, may I hand it over now for what you're all waiting for, the Q&A session with the authors and Anne. Niklas, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm Niklas Höhne. I'm with New Climate Institute, and this is also my 14th UNEP emissions gap report as an author. And I think this broken record really speaks to my heart. I mean, this is not the first time we are saying this is this huge gap. And in particular this year, where it's very clear that actually each year we need a significant progress if we want to close this gap. So this year not as much has happened. Something has happened, but really not as much as necessary. And that's why we are sitting here in this panel to now find out what needs to happen and how we can incentivize this. So the real question of this panel is to say what is needed now from the global stocktake to, well, close the gap in the long run. And with me I have, well, Anne Ohnhoff. You have seen her and heard her already. Without her, the UNEP emissions gap report wouldn't exist. So thank you very much for all your hard work on this one. But without the authors, it would also not exist. So we have here Yuri Rögeli from the Imperial College in London. We have Oliver Geden from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs. And we have Jakub Mulugeta from University College London. And unfortunately, Lorna-Lisa Kokler from UNFCCC can't be here, but we have Bernd Hackmann from the UNFCCC Secretariat. And Inga Andersen unfortunately had to leave already for other commitments. What I want to do now, I would like to give you the floor quickly, the new panelists, to quickly tell me what your main insights are from the UNEP emissions gap report on how the global stocktake needs to react to this and what we need to move forward to close the gap. Yuri, maybe you can kick us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. As you mentioned, the message of the gap report is clear. There is a gap and it needs to be closed. And so if I think about the implications for the global stocktake, it directly refers to this clear gap. First and foremost, I think there needs to be a clear acknowledgement of this global shortfall in ambition, and that this gap exists, and that it is quite large. But then I think also the political implications of that kind of factual assessment need to be clear. The results in the analysis show that a large or almost half a degree of warming can be avoided by actually implementing the conditional pledges. Conditional pledges are or can be implemented if the conditionalities are being met, and that means that finance is being made available to countries to implement them. So that is one first important implication. The second important lever that we see in order to come closer to meeting the Paris Agreement is indeed to make these long-term pledges, the net zero targets, more credible. There are two key ways of doing that. First of all, it is to deliver and to present credible implementation plans of how those long-term pledges are going to be achieved. And part of those credible long-term implication plans is always delivery of reductions by 2030 and increasing the ambition by 2030, because the reductions in 2030 are the gateway to actually achieving long-term net zero pledges.
Thanks, Jerry. That's great. So you said acknowledging the gap. I mean, we've produced the gap report. I mean, that there is a gap is pretty known, and but maybe it's not. You're saying it's not acknowledged enough. No, that I think this process should really say. I mean, it's 12:05. It's the 2030 level that needs to be improved. No. And you said something about money, probably, the conditional pledges. You didn't say money, but I think that's what you meant. They are conditional to financial support, and maybe that needs to be put on the table. Very good. Then let's see what your insights are, Oliver, on how we can move this forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was responsible for the carbon dioxide removal chapter together with the all other lead authors, and I will present 2 points on that and a more fundamental one. I think since the role of carbon dioxide removal has been more highlighted in recent years, and sometimes it's also highlighted in NDCs, but in a rather ambiguous way, I think it would be prudent if countries are asked by the global stocktake outcome, and then doing that already in the NDCs in the next round to clarify what the role is, starting with carbon dioxide removal from forestry, which many countries already have in there, but it's quite ambiguous what the role in national targets is expected to be, and it's really hard to assess that. It would also be prudent in NDCs to make carbon dioxide removal a standard item in these ICTU tables. Beyond that, and we don't have that in the report, but I think it logically follows from the report, we not only talk about carbon dioxide removal to achieve net zero, just counterbalancing the amount of residual emissions, since many of these pathways that go into the calculation of the gap are overshoot pathways, so they would reach net negative emissions in the second half of the century, net negative CO2 emissions, to reverse the temperature increase. It would also be prudent if countries, developed countries, start thinking and probably announcing net negative national targets, because it's only going to happen if some countries even promise. The only one we have right now is Denmark with a minus 110% target for 2050. So some countries will need to go beyond net zero or below net zero. And the third more fundamental one, and probably most idealistic or utopian one, is a phase down of ambiguous language in COP decisions. I mean, we have seen more than enough of that. Maybe it's not going to happen. Phase down, I mean, maybe that's a realistic proposal. We will never see phase out, because then you would not get to agreement. Yeah, but we have seen so many formulas over time being repeated and not being delivered on. Thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. That's really good. A phase out of ambiguous language would be even better, I think, but you alluded to it. I like the point on transparency on the net zero targets. I mean, we've just before launched a report from the Climate Action Tracker where we tried to find out how much negative or carbon removal the countries have in their net zero targets. And first of all, it was very difficult because countries don't say. And second, if you then make some assumptions, it's quite a lot. So on average, or in total, it was 20% of their current emissions would somehow be removed at the point when they reach their net zero targets. And for some countries, that share is even higher. It's higher, almost 30% of emissions are still there when they claim to reach zero, but it's not zero, because they assume that a lot of the emissions are removed from the atmosphere. And as we've seen in the report, that's difficult. Thanks, Oliver. Then going over to Jakob, what are your insights from the GAP report that the global stocktake should take up?
I was part of a team with Narasimha Rao looking at the transition questions for low and middle income countries, and that was the chapter we were taking. Now, one thing that is evident, of course, it's not new to anyone here, is that we're looking at countries at different levels of development. You've got countries that are, of course, fossil fuel exporting, others that are heavy fossil fuel users. There are others that have made some significant headway into renewable energy. And many, many others are also importers. So in a sense, we're looking at a very complicated picture there. And therefore, the message coming through that chapter is that each country will pursue its development in different ways, given where they are in their development stage. Now, this is particularly important to highlight the LDC countries, for example, that have a much pressing questions, issues related to development. And when I mean development, we weren't just covering, GDP growth or income, but rather in a much broader sense that there is quite significant poverty, and talked about the really heavy energy access problems, both for cooking as well as electricity and so forth. And many others are also looking to explore industrialization in that in their journey towards their development future. One other thing to also highlight is that a lot of these countries, particularly the LDC countries, leaving aside the heavy emitters within the LMIC category, are close enough to net zero. So in a sense, what else is it that they can achieve? Of course, they are close to net zero, not by choice, but by because they have been, in a sense. The level of development inevitably reflects that. So the pathway, of course, then would have to be, that needs to be sort of highlighted also in the global stocktake, is that how can countries pursue development without increasing their greenhouse gas emissions? So in a sense, how do they avoid future emissions? And of course, there are a variety of pathways for this, but one of which is what they can do in their energy. And of course, heavy use of transition towards renewables for their future, as they build their future energy systems, which are yet to be built. Now, the big question here, and it has been a big question for the past 15 years since Copenhagen, is the big elephant in the room, or is it the elephant in the room, should I say? And that's a question of finance. And one thing that is coming through also in our chapter is that the cost of capital for the poorest countries is significant, is quite high. We talk a lot about renewable energy being cheap, which is true. It has come down significantly. But in terms of countries accessing renewable energy through affordable finance, we're still at a very early stage, and perhaps in a difficult stage. I think those are the issues that would need to be considered, and those are the questions that we highlighted in the chapter. Thank you.
Excellent, Jakob. And yeah, you really mentioned the issue of developing without increasing emissions. And well, if you search for positive news, I think one of my positive news is that the renewable energy is expanding again much faster than expected. So especially solar. So the price is going down, and we're expanding it much faster, maybe even as fast enough as necessary for the 1.5 degree goal. And in your chapter, you said it's not anymore the costs of generation, it's the cost of capital, which is now the major barrier. So that's also better than before. Before it was also the cost of generation. That's out, that's not the problem anymore, it's something else. And yeah, countries have tools to help each other to get the cost of capital down. Excellent. Then last but not least, Bernhard, tell us what you think from your perspective, coming from the UNFCCC Secretariat, of what the global stocktake should do here.
Thank you so much. I think, first of all, as also Simon Steele mentioned this morning, we also published a report on the NDCs, and being now last in this row is actually comes in very handy, because the messages are the same. And that is, I think, showing once more how, on one end, of course, within the UN we can cooperate, but also how clear it is, on one end, where we are, and also what needs to be done. And I think that's something that comes out of these reports, and that's something the global stocktake has to pick up, is on one hand, looking back and say where we are. And here, I think, looking in both ways, a lot happened, as you just mentioned, since Paris, and also before, with the cost of technologies, with even having this conversation. I think when you look at GAP report number 1 and see how the conversation evolved, and that's something very positive. Unfortunately, and I think that's the other side of this message, we are very far from where we need to be. And I think these two messages have to be very clear, and this urgency that we now need to do more, and that's the next step, is a clear understanding what comes next, how can we move there. And I think again, also here the reports and what countries put forward in their NDCs, and I think this morning came out another iteration of the GST draft text. This is becoming increasingly clear to everyone what actually needs to be done. And I think what we need to talk much more about is similar to what you said, Yuri, also what you said, Jakob, is the enablers. It's the access to capital. It is implementing the conditional targets. I think there is already a very clear hint in there or message in there that we need to work together. We need to provide the support that is needed. We need to help provide access to capital, access to these technologies that are available. And I think then we can get this actually done and work this out. And I think cooperation has never been as important as it is now on all of these aspects, so that also, as you said, Jacob, that everyone has the right and the opportunity to develop along their own path. But that needs a lot of support. And what I think is also clear out of these many years of experience is that the experiences are there. We also need to start sharing them, because everyone has a different take to it, but everyone has a similar problem. So sharing this, working together, moving forward, there is a chance of getting this done. And yeah, thanks for having me on the panel.
Thank you, Bernhard. And thanks also for highlighting the things that have gone better over the years. I mean, I think when we started with the GAP report, we calculated temperature increase numbers of, I don't know, 3.5 or 4 degrees even under the business as usual scenario. These high temperature increase levels are off the table. So it's somewhere 3, maybe 2.5, and the most optimistic one somewhere below 2, which is much, much better than before. Still not good enough, but at least moving in the right direction. And the other thing that you mentioned is the urgency. I mean, if we don't change our projection of emissions in 2030, if we don't change that until 2030 in the short term, then 1.5 degrees is lost, at least without a significant overshoot. That's the message. So 2030 needs to change. With that, we had our introductory remarks from the panel. We have 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience. There will be a mic being passed around. If you get the mic, then please identify yourself and ask your question. There's a question in the back there. And stand up, maybe then we can see you better.
Sure. Joshua Sarnoff, DePaul University. Could you address the Hansen warming in the pipeline, and also whether, given the almost inevitability of overshooting 1.5, we should really be considering solar radiation management techniques? Similarly, to the extent that we're going to be talking about massive transfers of technology to the developing world, could you say something about price controls and the amount of profits that the private sector will otherwise make if we don't adopt them, which then reduces the amount of funding that's needed? Finally, might you say something about whether, with ambiguities in the text, it might simply be better not to have agreement and call the problems what they are?
Thank you. We had a bit of difficulty to understand everything, at least me, but I caught 2 questions. One is on solar radiation management, and the other one is on price control and the enormous profits that are currently made by the fossil fuel industry. Let's cover with that. Is anybody wanting to take the question on solar radiation management? Sorry?
There was also a linked to warming in the pipeline.
Okay, well then do that, Yuri.
Yeah, and then others can add to it. Yeah, so our warming projections, they fully take into account the latest assessment of both the magnitude of warming to be expected from CO2 and the additional warming that could happen after we reach net zero emissions. So that is fully taken into account in these pathways. I also want to highlight that these pathways that actually, as long as we keep emitting CO2, it is clear that warming will be increasing. From a risk avoidance perspective and knowing the large uncertainties and particularly the distributional effects of solar radiation modification, I don't think it's kind of a feasible or a reasonable proposition. if we are unable to come together to implement measures at a national level that have clear co-benefits and that are reducing our emissions, solar radiation modification would require full cooperation and collaboration on a global scale in order to reach a certain level of cooling. To me, that sounds totally unrealistic and irresponsible.
Okay, Oliver?
Just to add, there has been a UNEP expert report on solar radiation modification, I think earlier this year or last year, I don't remember exactly, but it has not been considered here. And I'm also of the opinion that at this point it's highly speculative and you don't really need to consider it for the levels of overshoot we are talking right now. So in the IPCC and UNEP emissions gap logic, these are pathways that either go to 1.6 or 1.8. And I think it would not be prudent even to consider solar radiation modification on these levels.
Thank you. Jakob, you look like you want to say something about the price control, maybe?
Price control of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing we must recognize is that there is a huge flow of finance into fossil fuels, has been historically, and it continues to be. But I think it's even more pernicious now in the sense that there is a much greater concentration of resources, financial resources coming through fossil fuels in a few hands. And this is also a reflection perhaps of a much bigger malaise that we see. And to some extent, there was a vote that was taken, I think, was it a week or two ago at the UN about discussion around global taxation to try and see if this is one way around it. So what we saw was a split between North and South. And I think, we have a deficit of trust and a deficit of collaboration. And we talk about solidarity as the framing sometimes when we talk about the climate crisis. But when we see it in action, I don't think that's happening. And if we are, and I'm speaking from an African perspective, where you have very high level of energy in access, high level of poverty, and yet, we know that what we have the technologies, but in order to access the technologies to be able to transition into better living conditions, the hands are tied because of what we talked about, the cost of finance, the cost of capital. So I think, the approach that we have been marching on hasn't worked, largely because those countries are having to look for finance in international markets, which tend to be a lot more cautious, whereas it's easy to be able to access finance if you're doing something on renewables in the US or in the EU, because you do have mature domestic markets. So we have a serious sort of inequality and a problem there. But on the question of what to do, I do think that there is a heavy concentration of resources in the fossil fuels, and I think if there is a way, whether it's through price control or through some other levy means, to be able to have some of that transferred to renewables, it makes complete sense to me. Thank you.
And you wanted to add something?
Yes, thank you. No, I just wanted to add that you can say, in fact, we have price control. It's just been the wrong kind of price control. We still have enormous amounts of finance going into fossil fuel subsidies. And the no-brainer here would be to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies in order to basically encourage the change that's needed. I saw recent numbers updates from the IMF saying that if you both look at direct subsidies and also the pricing due to effects, millions of people dying basically from the burning, direct air quality effects of burning of fossil fuels and so forth. It's more than $7 trillion US annually. And if you got the prices right, you'd actually achieve the emissions reductions that we need to get on course for below 2 degrees right away. So that's a no-brainer. And then you can say that in addition, what our report shows, and I'm not referring directly to solar radiation management, but still these hypothetical solutions in the future, is the cheapest and safest reductions or solutions here. We have them on the table, and yeah, basically it's the best emissions are the emissions reduced or the emissions avoided.
Thank you very much. Time is almost running out, but we have time for one more questions, and let's see for short question and short answers. Over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Edith Adera with the African Development Bank. I have a question for Jakub. You mentioned that the least developing countries are already low emitters, but what are the practical ways in which they can actually transition, given that many of them are discovering these resources now, and within the context of common but differentiated responsibilities? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. How can these countries keep the fossil fuels on the ground?
Well, I mean, I think it's both a practical and ethical question. I mean, on the ethical side, while the rest of the world is not making the kind of effort that's necessary, how can you tell a country like Nigeria to phase out? So that's quite a difficult one. And I think, you know, what I would like to see if that's the case is for a country like Nigeria, for example, to be able to capture the value across the chain. Right now, what you have is that, you know, I mean, things are improving, obviously, but you know, countries are exporting crude, but to import, you know, finished products without, you know, where processing takes place elsewhere, and value is obviously exported. So in a sense, you know, countries have become are part of that extractivist type of economy, but at the lower end of the chain. So that needs changing. Now, with countries that are discovering new fossil fuel to enter into the market, they have to think in terms of, you know, what it means for the future. Because much of the data that we're getting, whether it's IPCC or so, demand for fossil fuel is decreasing. So they will find themselves at a point where their heavily invested sort of infrastructure will become stranded. So that's a real worry. So it's a question of whether, you know, countries really have to think in terms of the long term rather than the short term gains of capital that they may get.
Thanks, Jakob. I think that's a good final word for keeping the value chain in the country and taking all the benefits of it and not exporting it without giving the benefits to others. Unfortunately, time's up. I think this was a really, really good panel. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, the organizers. Thank you for the panel. And I hope, given, the bleak message of the GAP report, we still were able to give you a little bit of hope that we can do it. I think we can. We have all the options on the table. We simply need to do it and need to have the political will to do it and not focus on the false solutions, but focus on the right ones. With that, thank you very much and see you next week.